Our previous episode set forth both the content and context of Luther's Catechism as a whole. As you may recall, Luther understood that the commandments are indispensable to Christian life and faith. Luther, in the preface to the large catechism, wrote, quote, "This much is certain. Those who know the 10 Commandments perfectly know the entire Scriptures, and in all affairs and circumstances are able to counsel, help, comfort, judge, and make decisions in both spiritual and temporal matters. They are qualified to be a judge over all doctrines, walks of life, spirits, legal matters, and everything else in the world. Moreover, what is the whole Psalter but meditation and exercises based on the first commandment?" End quote.
By now, you're likely seeing a pattern in these episodes. To begin with, we start with the text itself. Essentially, this is taking Melanchthon's method by working through the first couple of questions of Inventio, starting with question, what is it? But we aren't stopping there. The final question of Inventio, what are its effects, helps round out our understanding. Simply put, it isn't sufficient to be able to recite the 10 Commandments. Instead, one must have a strong sense of how the commandments function in the life of faith. This is why we need to spend time in this episode talking about the function of the law.
To illustrate this point, and it's been a while since I've had a chance to do this, let's take a moment for a word nerd. The word we need to unpack is the Hebrew word Shema. Shema is an important word in relation to the commandments because it is the expected outcome of the commandments. Shema is defined as to obey. However, and this is key, it also means to hear. In other words, in the Hebrew, and it's a similar word in the Greek, to hear is to obey. People tend to hear the word obey as an active verb, something they do. But when you understand it as Shema, to hear, then you understand you are not in control of what you hear. Therefore, you are not in control of your obedience. Chris, why don't you talk about how Shema ties into the commandments?
Sure. You can start to get a sense of how simply knowing the commandments, as in reciting them, knowing what they are in the abstract, falls short of a confessional Lutheran understanding. Instead, we understand that when you hear God speaking, you obey God speaking. You can't separate the proclamation of God's word from the effect of God's word. So, we now move to the next question, an important one before we get to the text of the commandments. What is the effect of hearing? That is to say, what happens to a believer when one obeys the law? Simply put, what is the function of the law?
Right. Looking at Luther's explanation of the commandments, we can see that the function of the command is front and center. In the Small Catechism, each explanation begins with the words, "We are to fear and love God."
Right. Now be aware, Luther isn't speaking to one's potential with the words fear and love, telling you what you need to do. If you think about it, you'll see that if you understood the words, "We are to fear and love," as potential, then this would assume that you can control whether or not you are afraid. All you have to do is watch a YouTube video or a prank video, and you'll quickly see how much we are in control of fear.
Speaking from experience, are we? Anyway, that's a good segue to talking about what Luther sets forth as the effects of the law. And the first effect is fear. Often, people can be a bit troubled by the fact that God expects you to fear Him. Why would God want us to fear Him? Doesn't He want us to love Him?
Well, sure, but it's helpful here to understand what Luther recognized the fear of God to entail. By 1514, Luther had already distinguished 3 types of people who fear God. First, those who fear punishment without truly fearing God. Second, those who fear both God and His wrath. And third, those whose trust in God is so strong that fear of punishment never crosses their minds, but who still fear God in the same way children fear and revere their parents, whom they do not want to offend.
Now let's look at that second effect of the law as Luther lays it out, love. Just as we don't control our fear, we don't control our love. Why do we say someone is falling in love? Well, if we were in control of it, we'd say we are sitting down in love, not falling head over heels. We can't make ourselves love something or someone, or stop loving someone or something, for that matter.
But buyer beware on this one. Too often, when the word love comes into the equation, confusion sets in. The confusion is what we talk about as distinguishing the law from the gospel. And in regard to the word love, the confusion occurs when one fails to distinguish who is doing the loving. With commandments and Luther's explanation, we are not speaking of God's love for us, which obviously is the gospel. No, we are speaking of God's expectation, command of us, which is to love God. This is not the gospel. It is the law. So as to be clear, we will say it one more time. Love is not necessarily the gospel. More often than not, it is the law.
Right. Now pay attention here because time and again, you'll hear people tell you that part and parcel to the good news of Jesus Christ, that is to say the gospel, is loving your neighbor and loving God. This is a fatal mistake.
But don't simply take our word for it. Listen to Jesus on this one. When asked, what should one do to enter the kingdom of heaven? Jesus says, what does the law say? And then he goes on to set forth the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself.
Jesus' words here help us illustrate the point about the function of the law. When the rich man tells Jesus that he has done all of these things, Jesus tells the man to go and sell everything and give it to the poor. Jesus' words of command do not function to give the man peace. In fact, the function of the command sends the man away sad.
And this is what we know to be the ultimate function of the law, the role of the commandments in the life of the Christian. The accuse, attack, and kill the conscience.
So we return to our previous point. We can start to see how the function of the law is not something we control. So let's go back to our word nerd moment. Shema and our obedience is not a matter of potential, but it's the outcome of hearing the commands. So when the commandments are placed in the ears and conscience of the Christian, the effect is not to comfort or bring about peace. Rather, they accuse the conscience.
Now let's return to the content of the commandments. In one of our earlier episodes, you heard us make a distinction between the first table of the law and the second table. The distinction is between the first 3 commandments, which pertain to our relationship with God, and the last 7, which concern our relationship with our neighbors. Keeping that in mind, we need to make another point, namely the relationship between commandments 2 through 10 to the first commandment. The point here again pertains to the function of the commandments.
Commandments 2 through 10 proceed from the first commandment. When we fulfill the first commandment, we fulfill all of the commandments. And when we break the first commandment, we break all of the commandments. That means they always function to accuse us of not being in control, not loving our neighbors as ourselves, etc. And Luther pointed to the breaking of the first commandment as the root cause. We do not fear, love, and trust in God above all things. They also focus us on the disorder in our lives by spotlighting the reality that we've turned to other gods. We've broken the first commandment. Put another way, commandments 2 through 10 identify the symptoms of breaking commandment number 1.
Having explained the function of the commandments and thus the function of the law, it's important for us to lay out another interesting distinction Luther recognizes. And so, we turn again to one of the inventio questions found in Melanchthon's method, the question of what are the parts of the law?
Now, buckle up, because this distinction usually throws people for a loop when they first run into it. Ready for this one? The 10 Commandments were not given to Christians. Ultimately, they were given specifically to the Jews, and they alone need to heed them for righteousness.
Say what? I think you should repeat that again so that people don't think you made a mistake, Sarah, because you just threw out a big matzo ball, so to speak.
Funny. It's a twist for sure, because people will be thinking we just got rid of the law, but that is far from the case. We're simply quoting Luther. Then again, there are people who thought Luther was trying to get rid of the law as well. Now, to be sure, Luther was not delegitimizing the commandments. Luther understood that the 10 Commandments were nothing more than the Jewish expression of the natural law, which God has placed on the hearts of all people. Thus, they applied to the German people of his day, not because Moses spoke them, but because God had written that natural law into the entirety of human existence. Now, nowadays, natural law has more of a kind of a mother nature sense, an impersonal sense. But that's not what Luther understood the natural law to be. Rather, it's more the general understanding of right and wrong written on our hearts, as the Apostle Paul put it in Romans 2, verses 14 to 15.
So while it remains true that the commandments were given to the Jews and not to the Gentiles, this doesn't reduce the value of them in the conscience of the Christian, because the function of the law in the life of the Christian is universal. In other words, the commandments are valued in the life of the Christian because of what they do.
As a way of wrapping up this episode, we need to talk briefly about something you'll hear us talk about more in future episodes. What Luther and his colleagues called the uses of the law. And when they said uses, they were speaking about the activity or function of the law.
Right. Luther understood that there are two uses of the law. The first use is what we call the civil use. The understanding here is that the law functions to curb or reduce bad actions through the threat of punishment and promise of reward. So the law temporarily works to keep society and neighbors in check and establish some semblance of order. To be sure, though, Luther did not put much faith in this curbing power of the law. He knew we are bound to do what we want to do.
And so, given the reality that no one actually fulfills the law willingly, Luther identified a second function, or what we call use of the law, the proper function. This is what God intends the law to do. And what God intends the law to do is to convict us of our selfishness, our not fulfilling the first commandment, and thus all the rest of the commandments. It holds the mirror up to our desire to be our own God and control the world. In doing this, the law attacks our ego, and it drives us to despair, terror, and humility, so that we know the depth of our sin.
We'll let you sit on that one for a while. Mess around with that matzo ball, so to speak.
Whatever. Clearly, we need to be done with this episode. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the first commandment and how it is God uses the commandments to kill us in order to make sure we have only the one true God himself.